This video is going to cover chapters 12 and 13 from the Smith textbook, specifically focusing in this first section on context, function, and media, and then in the second section on postmodernism as well as feminism. So Smith talks off by talking specifically about how context makes huge difference in our approach to rhetorical theory and our discussions about rhetorical theory, and how we talk about how meaning is made, how values are understood and how values are communicated and how ideas are exchanged and how a lot of that comes back to context. So the big question, the big discussion at the beginning is, what is context? So here on the slideshow you can see three different images of a classroom context. One at the bottom is obviously group work, the middle one is obviously online, and then the top one is your traditional face-to-face classroom. Traditional, obviously, classrooms look slightly different than this now. So when we talk about context, in theory, all three of these are treated exactly the same. Learning should happen exactly the same. It's school. But we all know that learning happens very differently in each of these three. The approach to learning, the approach to discussion needs to be very different in each of these three contexts. So rhetorical theory is now trying to account for that. So Smith starts off by talking about contingency, connotation, and context, and the way that the three of those have interactions and how our meaning, so one word in one situation can mean something completely different in another, and context can influence how we make sense of that word or that entire communication act. So the second portion that he talks about is function or functional, and then what this does for rhetoric. So make sure you read that particular section. Okay, so we're going to talk about Richards and kind of our return to semiotics. So we're trying to match the word, which is the sign, with the object, which is the referent, by pointing out how context, past experience, and cultural inference can corrupt or clarify meaning. So context can change what a word means and how we understand a word. So when I say a word like desk, desk means something different at home than it does in a classroom, and even student desks can be very different than that. So we need to understand, what does this mean, and then how does this change how we function, how we sit, how we take notes, what we get out, how we interact with our peers because of that, how we actually, where we choose to sit based on the desks that are available. So I teach in a face-to-face classroom that has round tables, and so it's all set up as groups. Students have to account for how they want to sit and where they want to sit, and then how that's going to influence their note-taking and their interactions with their peers. So they're going to choose specific seats accordingly to make the best kind of meaning that they can, because that's what the context looks like. It's not your traditional desks. And so all of this comes back to, all of Richard's approach to semiotics come back to hermeneutics, and so kind of a shift in the definition of hermeneutics to the interpretation of the sign in context, which is now communication. So we make meaning of communication not just through language anymore. So when we were reading about early semiotics, especially in the Dark Ages, it was all the word and the idea, especially when Logos was the same as God and God's word. Now we're accounting for context. So how is this particular approach, even this video with the slide in the background and my little video on the side, how is this mixing to help you make meaning, and how are you figuring out how to read and how to interact with this video? How many times do you stop it, if at all? Do you work on other things while this plays in the background? All of those are approaches to making sense of the context. None of them are wrong, and that's what Richards is accounting for. How do we make meaning in these contexts? So he talks about the proper meanings, superstition, as well as the proper usage. Superstition, so if we start to really hold on to the fact that words have one exact meaning always, we're going to have major problems with communication. And with the proper usage, if we say that words have one correct usage, we're going to have problems. But there are situations where both of these do hold true. So in politics, if a politician throws out a word, let's say something really, really controversial like abortion, depending on who's saying it, it has one meaning, or it has one particular interpretation based on that person. So most of the time, if it's a Republican using the term abortion, it's a bad thing. If it's a Democrat, we're not so sure. We have to figure out who the Democrat is and what we think. We have to make meaning of it. We have to work a little harder to understand that particular usage of that word until we become familiar with that politician's usage. Again, I'm overgeneralizing just to give an example for these two approaches. The second part is context's theorem of meaning, which prevents the improper readings and baseless assumptions about meaning. So we've got denotative meaning and connotative meaning, and each of these have very specific dictionary definitions or meanings in context. And so again, Richard's entire theory is drawing attention to the context and how context influences how we make meaning of the language, how we make meaning of all of this understanding, how we make meaning of the Communication Act. The really important thing to note here is that it shifts the burden to the audience. The audience has to work to understand what's going on until they get to a point where they're comfortable with the person that's communicating so they can understand it a little bit faster. The second set of theorists that we talked about were Perlman and Ulbricht-Titeka. In very specific composition textbooks, Perlman and Ulbricht-Titeka and their approach to audience as well as their approach to argumentation with the idea of loci, they're very influential for how we teach freshman composition, especially freshman composition students, to put together an argument. Not as much as others, but they do pop up every now and then. So just keep that in mind when you're reading through this. You will see it pop up every now and then in freshman composition texts. So what we're looking at is the universal audience continuum with the actual audience and who can be persuaded and how they have to be persuaded and how a speaker kind of gauges where on the spectrum their audience is so they can make the appropriate language choices. They're also kind of rewriting and reinventing Aristotle's topoi if they're helpful to the persuasion that you need in that particular situation. Toolman is also very, very common in freshman composition textbooks for how do you put together a strong argument. Toolman arguments are very popular still in law. They're starting to be phased out a little bit of freshman composition texts, but again, they do pop up every now and then. So we have the grounds and the reason and the evidence. We have warrants, backing, rebuttal, qualifier claims, and the very specific way of interacting or of organizing each of these different pieces so that the argument is very, very strong. So Toolman was trying to break down how do we understand and how do we make sense of. This is very reminiscent of the sophist approach, with the head, the body, and the conclusion. How do we break down an argument in a more digestible format so that it's understandable by people who are listening to us? Finally, we have McLuhan, who was one of the first to kind of theorize the idea of the global village, that all of these technologies that were popping up were shrinking the world from being the world with all of these weird, crazy, strange places to the world where we knew quite a bit about a lot of different cultures, and we become very, very dependent on all of these other cultures, all of these other countries, all of these other places of information to the point that it's a global village. So village, with the consideration of it being a small place, instead it's the entire world. So McLuhan's famous line is that the medium is the message, meaning the medium, the actual technology delivery, in some cases, and for McLuhan in all cases, is more important than the message because it's going to influence the context or the contextual understanding that's expected from the particular audience, which means the audience is going to try to understand in a very specific way because of that. I think that we can kind of say that the medium and the message are most important now, but McLuhan was the medium is the message. So McLuhan had hot mediums and cold mediums, and then this continuum in the middle with audience distortion. For McLuhan, a hot medium extends a single sense in high definition. It fills in all of the blanks for you, so it requires very little audience thought. There's less chance for distortion. And a cold medium extends several senses. It doesn't fill in all of the blanks. The audience has to add a lot, so there's more chance for distortion, which means mediation, or the medium actually helping influence how the message is received, is now a rhetorical fact of life. It's not just reading, it's not just print, it's all of these other mediums as well, with the potential for audience distortion in there. Okay, we're going to switch over to chapter 13 now, and we'll see how all of this context is being picked up again and being considered with all of our postmodern questions. Okay, we're going to go through chapter 13. Smith basically loads this chapter with as much theory as he possibly can. So we'll go through pieces of it to help contextualize it. But with the feminists, he only covers so much, so there's only so much that we're going to cover as well. If it's something that you're interested in, I have books and books and books and books that can help support all of that. So we start off with kind of a comparison between postmodernism and modernism. For our purposes, this is important to see what it is the postmoderns are reacting to, but you're not going to have, specific questions in relation to this. For the most part, what we're seeing is that the postmoderns don't think that there's one identity and there's not one right answer. And those are really huge changes from modernism, where there was a lot of unity and we were always looking for the big T truth. We're now on the idea that we live fragmented lives. There are multiple truths and we need to account for that. So the most famous is Foucault, who talks about master narratives and dominant power structures. So Foucault is reading Marx and Marx's critical theory and critical questions and saying, how do we view this if there is no one right answer? If the proletariat overthrowing the bourgeois is not always the right answer, what do we end up with? And so Foucault starts to find that knowledge itself is reified in very, very specific ways. It's reread, it's retaught, and it's re-understood in the exact same way over and over and over. So histories have dominant power structures to them that influences the way that history is read and the way that history is taught, that then influences how a culture will make sense of information. At some point, I think it was last year, Texas and Colorado both attempted to change the history textbooks that were used in their high school classes to remove words like slave and slavery and slavehood. I believe it was Texas specifically that wanted to change it to indentured servant or indentured servitude to kind of make it similar to what we saw in England during the Industrial Revolution, but a lot of people had problems with that. And so if we read it from a Foucault standpoint, they were attempting to change the official knowledge, the official way that we make sense of a very specific historical situation, and then all of the understandings that come from that, all of the race relations that are still heavily impacted by that portion of American history today, all of that becomes a part of the official knowledge. Subjugated knowledge then is, what are these little pockets, that are around the official knowledge, and how do people make sense of those particular pockets? What is it that we as rhetoricians now know specifically about rhetoric and the ties between rhetoric, education, and politics that a lot of other people don't understand? Most people don't understand that the freshman composition class is a very political course, not just in the overall, politics of the university, politics of most work positions, but the goals of a freshman composition class, since composition was kind of designed. So since open admissions, when more students started to gain access to college education, universities realized that they needed to prepare these students to be good democratic citizens in the United States, which meant a very specific approach to education. Freshman composition is that course. So that's a subjugated knowledge. Most people see it as, I'm going to learn everything that I ever needed to know about writing in 15 weeks, which is next to impossible, but that's kind of the assumption about the course. But in addition to that, a lot of the thinking that's asked of students in that class and a lot of the discussions that occur in that class are very subjugated knowledge from a retcon perspective, where we see a lot of the historical political ties and most people aren't aware of this. So we've got official knowledge, here's what everybody knows. This can change, this can shift, but for the most part it attempts to reify itself over and over and over. And then we have subjugated knowledge, which are all of these little pockets of information, pockets of people who know different things for different purposes. So Foucault wants to know how knowledge can sustain and define and rationalize or undermine power. How does power define, sustain, or undermine knowledge? And what role does discourse or actual language practices play in these relationships? So for rhetoric, he's trying to restore speech as an event. He's trying to restore speech as a performance. So we're bringing Burke back into the conversation as well, where everything is a performance. And then he wants to use those two approaches to resist power and then expose power through language. And he's looking specifically at science, history, humanities, pop culture, everyday life, education, government, media, pretty much everything. So Foucault is really, really big, and basically it's question everything, because we want to find out what power is teaching us and telling us we need to know. Leotard also picks up on master narratives, and he's looking specifically from master to more meta-narratives to fight hegemony. So we use master narratives and we use local narratives in very specific ways to build hegemony, to build ideas on this is the way that life is supposed to be. This is what you're supposed to understand. If we look at something very simplistic like fashion in the Phoenix area is very different than fashion in other other areas because of the temperatures, because of the landscape, because of a lot of climate influences, as well as people who live there. So how is that understood? And then when you transplant somebody from Phoenix to the East Coast, how is it now misunderstood possibly? The different is the way that theories of language must focus on specialized or localized fragments, performative more than constructive. And he's looking for ways to open up language use so that we can deprioritize values, beliefs, and kind of come to a position where we can question all of these by destabilizing all of the hegemony. So if we start to destabilize these little pieces, how quickly does it all crumble? And then what happens when it does, and how do we come to a new place from that? He's being influenced by Saussure and the very specific approaches to language, and Smith covers this in the textbook. Derrida is a deconstructionist, and deconstructionism is basically attempting to pull all the way back until we get to the original object and try to understand how to recontextualize that. So how do we recontextualize these things that we know, and what do we do with that? So the example that I've included here is the Mexican restaurant menu. How are each of these references supposed to be understood by us? Why are they supposed to be understood that way? How does some of this stuff make sense? If we look at food from a very, very basic standpoint, a lot of cultural foods rely on foods that are readily available in that particular area. So Spanish food, Mexican food are different because of what grows in those locations. We can also, trace influences and trace understandings, and that's what Derrida wants us to do, is how do we just keep deconstructing and pulling back and pulling back and pulling back, and then seeing where all of these things influence. Great questions. The problem with Derrida and the critique that's normally levied against deconstructionism is, at what point do you stop? Like, when do you ever think you're going to hit that endpoint where you've reached, like the primordial, to pull from the existentialists? You've reached the beginning. How would you ever know? So deconstruction is a good way to pull back and say, what influenced this? Why are we supposed to understand this? Why is there a burrito with 2 guns and, a hat with little beads hanging down from it? Why does the burrito look like this? Why these particular colors? Why are there even images on this particular menu? And the way that we use images on ethnic food menus is a very interesting thing that could then be talked about. So that's what Derrida wants us to do, is how do we pull all of these pieces apart so that we can understand them individually and how they then influenced this one particular communication act. So deconstructionism. Baudrillard talks more specifically about signs and symbols, and he's trying to understand that if we try to understand an object, we're going to be led away from its reality by the signification. So we're so caught up in understanding that we don't necessarily understand the particular object. So he's talking about the idea that reality is no longer real, which I think with all of our reality television we would totally agree with, that reality is presented in sound bites to keep our attention, and speech is all a performance. So what we're really looking at is, how do we understand the history? How do we understand how these particular ideas are supposed to work? And how do we kind of get beyond this dense web of meaning so that we can get to the more perfect, more original meaning of very specific signs? Okay, so then Smith switches to the feminists and feminism. He covers a lot of different versions of feminism very, very quickly. Some of them he covers well, some of them he doesn't. And obviously in contemporary culture, we're having a lot of discussions, in some cases fighting over what it means to be a feminist and what feminism is really looking for, whether there's a need for Black feminism and Asian feminism and Latina feminism, or if there's just one overarching feminism. When some women, especially celebrities, talk about feminism, they're critiqued for how it's whitewashed, or they're critiqued for it being too aggressive, so what does this all mean? Smith attempts to cover all of that in about 10 pages, which is a little tough. So I've got some basic notes here, but understand that feminism is very, very complex, and we can talk more about it, and we do have a couple other readings to add to this. So ecological feminism is culture and natural preservation. Socialist feminists are trying to reveal the oppression, achieve economic equality, embrace non-hierarchical sharing. Standpoint feminists endorse empirical studies of local narratives at the margins of society. Standpoint feminism is becoming very, very popular again because standpoint standpoint feminism is essentially calling for Black feminism and Latina feminism, and the understanding from all women and all people who claim to be feminists that each of us have different experiences, and in some cases our experiences can be heavily influenced by something simple like the color of our skin. So how does that unique experience to us influence how I'm going to understand feminism, how I'm going to enact feminism, how I'm going to agree with feminism? So standpoint feminism kind of opens up the kinds of feminism by allowing individuals to decide some of those things. Contemporary feminists oppose dichotomies and the approach of essentialist feminism, who tend to be exclusive and hegemonic. So how do we understand that not everything is exactly the same? Feminism is not just one thing. The experience of women is not just one experience. So how do we understand all of this? If we ignored skin color, class, and what you have access to, President Obama was recently critiqued for not understanding that there's a luxury tax on feminine products, so feminine hygiene products. For the most part, women have to have access to those, and they're being charged additional taxes because it's a luxury item. The same is true of diapers. Diapers are very expensive. So if you want to go the cloth route, how can you afford that upfront cost and then the maintenance of washing them on a regular basis, the access to washing machines so you can wash them on a regular basis? So the things that are typically related directly to women's work in the world, or women's lifestyle, or women's biology, they're being heavily taxed. And, so the question from most feminists at that point was, how is this fair? And Obama's response with, I had absolutely no idea this was happening, is what contemporary feminists as well as standpoint feminists are trying to point out. We have very specific experiences for very specific reasons. So now if you add economy into that equation, what is a woman who doesn't have access to money supposed to do once a month? So from a rhetorical perspective, rhetorical theory is trying to de-essentialize what it means to be feminist. So feminism is no longer meaning just one thing. Yes, equality is really important, but there are different versions of equality. There are different discussions. There are economic, there are racial, there are socioeconomic, there are workplace issues that can all come into the discussions that feminists want to have. It's not just one thing to be a feminist. Similar to the postmoderns, feminists find profound skepticism of generalized claims. So if we say all women do this, that's highly problematic. We need to figure out, okay, what are the individuals, what are these individual experiences, and what other issues need to be discussed so that we can fully understand this picture. Black feminists look at racism within feminist organizations as well as the specific challenges of race in relation to feminism. And then in a lot of these particular cases, there is the critique that there's a heterosexual bias. So most early feminism, as well as a lot of modern feminists, does come back to the idea that most women are heterosexual. And so what does that mean? How does that play out? So the critique against a woman who's a feminist who's wearing makeup is, well, how can you be a feminist if you're wearing makeup? Like, those two things are counterintuitive to the essentialized understanding of feminism. Feminists are supposed to be man-hating bra burners. So rhetorically, what we're trying to get at, and what a lot of these different approaches to feminism is getting at, is how do we de-essentialize that and understand that it's not just this one thing, that yes, there are feminist practices that look like that, but there are also feminist practices that look like something else. How do we understand all of this? And how do we account for all of the different possible experiences that women have in the world? Smith goes even more into, here's what everything does. Basically, early feminism was all about consciousness raising. So how do we teach women the things that they need to know to be public participants? If we go back to, earlier rhetorical theory with who has access to the public sphere, who's allowed to speak, who even understands the communication patterns that are expected, a lot of that comes back to education. So how do we educate women so that they can be activists for their own self-interests? And then after, and it's not that we've achieved that goal by any means, but after that goal was generally understood to have been achieved, then feminism became a lot more distinct, looking for very specific issues. So how do we understand, these kinds of gendered norms? How do we understand these kinds of practices? One of the big ones today is even the clothing that's available to young girls, like in Target. Target has a ridiculous amount of short shorts for little girls, which is a very specific kind of approach to how little girls are supposed to dress. But then the little girls aren't able to wear those to school because of school dress codes. So what girls have access to purchasing, what dress codes say girls can and can't wear, and the fact that most dress codes are gender biased against women. So we're sexualizing women through dress codes and saying, well, boys can't study if you look like that, so you need to go and fix it, which puts a huge inequality in that particular situation, saying it's men and boys who need to focus, and so you need to go and change yourself for a very specific reason so that they can continue to focus. So once we've raised the consciousness of women, how do we get to a point where all women are starting to ask those kinds of questions and starting to deal with those kinds of issues in a positive way to move things forward? Okay, so Smith goes through a lot of different women. We're going to go through them very briefly. One of my huge problems with Simone de Beauvoir is he refers to her as Sartre's girlfriend. You remember her from a picture with Sartre as Sartre's girlfriend. She was her own person. So the anti-feminist approach to just introducing Simone de Beauvoir was a huge problem to me. He does the same thing with Butler when he's like, Butler has all of these academic achievements. Why do academic achievements need to be associated with feminism? Good for her. She's a fantastic scholar, but is that necessary? So anyway, when we deal with these feminists, Simone de Beauvoir's most famous is that what is not born in woman, society makes woman. So biologically, yes, females have female parts, males have male parts, but that in itself does not actually influence anything. It's the societal practices, it's the cultural practices that make a female with female parts into a girl and that make a male with male parts into a boy and then tell them this is how you're supposed to act, this is what you're supposed to do. Girls are supposed to play with dolls and boys are supposed to play with trucks, and this is a difference and this is what we want to happen. Fraser talks about Habermas's public sphere and the way that the public sphere excludes women. So as part of the consciousness raising, women don't necessarily have access to the public sphere because historically they haven't. But the secondary problem, especially for Fraser, is do they have access to the education that they need to be able or capable of being taken seriously in that particular public sphere so that they can change it, especially minorities and women of low socioeconomic status. Do they have access to education? Do they have time to go to school? Those kinds of things. Bell Hooks talks about the white bias in feminism, especially in feminist writing and classical lit. So how do we understand that feminism is not just one thing? Again, we're trying to de-essentialize it. Adrienne Rich condemned the heterosexual bias. We've talked about that. Nancy Hartsock warns against postmodernism because it doesn't help to demarginalize women. It just helps to question. So what is it that we do once we've questioned, we've realized that women are on the side of society, that they're seen as less than, and that there are a lot of structures in place to keep them in that particular position. If we go back to the luxury taxes, it costs more to be a woman. Even if you don't wear makeup and you don't color your hair, shampoo in general that's made for women, soap that's made for women is more expensive. And then the normal products that women need to have access to for various reasons, so feminine hygiene products, they're taxed at a higher rate. It costs more to be a woman. And so Nancy Hartsock's like, postmodernism is not going to help us fix that. We already know these things, but not everybody knows these things. What do we do to fix that? How do we actually address it? And postmodernism for her is falling short. Gloria Anzaldúa talks about the existential call for creativity. So if we see women as having personal narratives and we see each woman as having a separate narrative and we see men as having personal narratives as well, how do we find power and strength from that particular personal narrative? And then how do we bring creativity back into all of these conversations that we're having as a way to help feminism? Betty Friedan redefines family as a private locale, making it a feminist niche. So how do we understand the woman's problem, which is Friedan's famous quote, and then what do we do to address that, and what do we do to understand that? There have been a lot of articles that I've seen recently that are trying to kind of overturn the idea that the husbands or the fathers of children are babysitters, because there was for a while, like a good solid 10 years, it was a joke, like, oh, the husband or the dad is just watching the kids today so that the mom can go and have some personal time. He's a stand-in babysitter and everything's going to go, completely awry, and it's going to be this big funny joke. There was that Michael Keaton movie back in the day, Mr. Mom, where in the first few days that was what it was, and it was a big joke and it's a big comedy and everybody laughs at it. And Betty Friedan's like, hang on a second. he's half of the picture here, this dad, this husband in, the heterosexual construction of the family. Why is he being marginalized in that very specific way? And how much power and pressure does that put on the mother? And then pressure from mainstream society as well. If there's anything wrong with that child, if that child acts out at all in school, it's her fault. The dad has absolutely nothing to do with it because he's the comic relief. It's all the mother's fault. Everything's the mother's fault. Thank you, Freud. So all of these women are agreeing with the postmodern rejection of objectivity. We all have individual experiences and we need to account for individual experiences. And they're also agreeing with the technology framing women as reproductive machines. So a lot of this marginalization has to do with the fact that women reproduce in very specific ways, and most of the marginalization is a result of that. They also agree with Marxism that women are unfairly defined by their tasks, again, in relation to women are reproductive machines. So we're using language to identify ourselves and to increase consciousness raising. And what we're really seeing through language is the way that a lot of language is used in culture to keep women on the sidelines is that we have man, and then we have everything else. And because women, minorities, people of low socioeconomic status fall into the everything else, they're automatically marginalized. Okay, so what happens and how are those individual experiences different? Hegemonic effect that conforms most society to patriarchy, and so women are then automatically sidelined. The last section that he really talks about are the idea of values and female values, how females are raised to be values, the kinds of values that are associated with that, and then which feminists speak about those. One of the big ones for me is Campbell with archetypal values. So what Campbell's really revealing through her discussion of values is that women communicate with women in very specific ways. Women communicate with men in very specific ways. Sometimes women and men struggle to communicate with each other. And what does that mean for how women are treated and how women are seen in society? Are they, again, made into the not man because of those particular communication patterns? And if, a woman is trying to, so what we saw in the 1980s with women going into the workforce, power suits for women became very popular. We see Hillary Clinton wear power suits almost every time she goes out. Ways of speaking and ways of understanding business talk, women were just expected to learn it as opposed to being allowed to speak the way or approach situations the way that, a woman might because of her particular unique experiences. So when we look at values and we look at values rhetorically, it's how are women, how are men taught values? How are these things similar? How are they different? How does that play out into society? And then how are those particular approaches valued or devalued, which reinforce patriarchy in very specific ways? Standpoint feminism is the individuals. Butler was a standpoint feminist. So Butler's discussion, and she's building off of de Beauvoir very heavily here, is that gender is a performance. So we perform girl, we perform boy in very, very specific ways. And her example are drag queens. So drag queens can perform feminine very, very, very well, which means gender is not just biology. There's so much more to it, especially if we're, passing as girl or passing as boy through our performance. That's more indicative of what gender is, the societal and cultural construction, than anything to do directly related with biology. So Butler really wants to question, what are these unique experiences when a woman's not just a baby-making machine? So when society sees a woman a very specific way and we use language in very specific ways, what happens? And then the last couple that Smith talks about are feminist legal theory. So what is the power of narrative and how can narrative have power in these new and unique positions? And why is that really, really important? And one of the big questions that they're asking is what is intended by the speaker and what is perceived by the listener? And then how do we understand the similarities and differences between those two things? Because there is narrative power and there's storytelling power behind all of this in very specific ways. Okay, this chapter was really, really, really dense with all of the theories. So if you have any questions about him, just post your questions on Twitter and we'll go through and we'll try to address them and we'll work through all of these particular ideas. If you want to work on any of these particular topics for your final paper, let me know and I'll help you narrow it down to a specific focus. I'll see you guys online.